Guy's offered me a place into the second year, provided I got the right school qualifications. So they offered me that, and I went to Guy's instead of to Aberdeen. And I suppose my whole life, in every way, would have been completely different, probably, if I'd come to Aberdeen rather than Guy's. But I had no intention initially of going there, but I spent most of the rest of my life there.
Well, you obviously had an interesting undergraduate career there. One of the most interesting things for me about that is that you chose to do a BSc. Now, that must have been more than exceptional in that era.
It was unusual, but it was a program that had already begun. I think we may have been the first year, or it may have been the second year. I'm afraid my memory breaks down at this point. But the idea was to allow people who wanted to do it, to having qualified with their first preclinical studies, to go ahead and take a full degree in some aspect of biology relevant to medicine, and then come back in after a year or two into the medical stream. And it obviously was a very intelligent and far-sighted decision on the part of London University to do this. And I decided I would like to apply for this. I can't remember now whether actually we were invited to or whether I applied. But obviously you had to be in the top few percent of your year. And for me it was a tremendously exciting period, because from really having had up till then it had been an extension of school. But this was a small group of highly motivated and probably highly intelligent people, and we were not only invited, we were actually forced to think for ourselves. We were asked questions, we were asked to set the agenda, we were asked to do things we had never been asked before. And in terms of education, it was a turning point. And I'm eternally grateful that I did take the opportunity.
What happened to the rest of them? Did they go into academic medicine?
A lot of them did. Chisholm, with course,
he was another one.
With whom I worked for many years. He became a clinician, of course. But I suppose the equivalent today would be, now you'd have to take a PhD. And in fact, indeed, people do now take PhDs and then return to clinical medicine. So I suppose the stakes have gone up. You could get by with a BSc, or in American terms, a BS. At that time, and count yourself as academically qualified. The course was interesting. I mean, part of it involved radioactivity, for instance, which at that time was really in the early mid-50s was quite excitingly new. How you could use radioisotopes to study biological systems and functions. It sounds bizarre now, but it was hot. It was a hot topic. And some of the techniques I learned in that BSc course, in fact, I used within the next decade in actual real frontline research. We did studies on several things. One of them I remember on bone with calcium-47, and presented. It was one of the first papers I ever gave, I think, in about 1959 or 60.
So at a very early stage, you're committed.
Yes, I mean, I came out of that knowing that I wanted to go into some aspect of, I hate the term academic medicine. It sounds terribly fusty and ghastly and sort of stuffy. But medicine in which continuous inquiry is a part of the day-to-day bread and butter. Every time you see something, you say, what does this mean? How did it come about? Can I learn something from this? Can I dissect it out? Could we set up a project to investigate this that might be fruitful? And of course, you can only get that within a teaching hospital and within a sort of the quote academic environment. So yes, in that sense, yes, I knew I wanted to take an academic career. I wasn't sure to begin with what particular area that I wanted to be in. I've still got notebooks that I kept as a student of all the papers I'd read, which is rather fascinating to look back on.
With comments?
Yes, I critically reviewed papers and things as a clinical student. The handwriting is oddly different from my handwriting now, but you know, I reviewed. I was attracted by all sorts of areas. For instance, as I went through the clinical services, I got very attracted, for example, at one time by neurology and even neurosurgery. Particularly, and jumping forward a little, when I got my higher medical qualification. In England, it's the MRCP. It's like taking your boards in the States for internal medicine. Very, very quickly, within about 9 months of qualifying in medicine, as one could do in those days, I suddenly thought to myself, since I was doing neurology, would I like to be a neurosurgeon and go on and take surgical qualifications? Because I love doing things with my hands. I wave them around a lot, as you see. But, and I always wished, I think many nephrologists are surgeons manqués. They have the personalities of surgeons.
The best ones, anyway.
The best ones, yeah.
So coming on forward slightly to, I mean, all of this seems very different from my image of guys in the late 50s.
Oh, guys in the late 50s
even looking back from when I first went there in the early 70s.
It was a very strange place, guys. It had been a great teaching school and I had seen many, many good people going through it. But it had become marooned. It was a sort of beached whale in the 1950s. There were one or two absolutely outstanding people there. Russell Brock, who became Lord Brock, the cardiothoracic surgeon who pioneered many of the techniques in collaboration with people at Johns Hopkins, with whom, of course, Guys has had and always has now still close links. Apart from his group and one or two others, there was really very little going on at Guys. There was a very strong clinical tradition, on the other hand. I mean, the degree of responsibility we had as students was frightening. I mean, we were responsible for the official case notes, for example. The house officers and the residents did not write the notes. The students wrote the notes. We did many of the tests, simple tests, blood sugars, proteinurias, quantitative proteinurias, blood pictures. Of course, if there was anything unusual, it would be referred to somebody who knew a bit more about it than we did. But the medico-legal implications of this now are quite terrifying. But of course, it gave us a tremendous feeling of being a part of the team. We related directly to the physician in charge of the patient. We were almost a parallel. We were a parallel link. There was a link through the houseman and the house officer and the resident, and there was the link to the student. And when the boss went round, he didn't turn to the house officer, he turned to the student and said, "Tell me about this patient." You had to give all your history and your findings without any reference to notes on every round. So
good
we were
training.
taught memory. Good training.
But what about the moving on then to the academic side of things? I know you hate the term, but your research training. John Butterfield, I know, is one of the sort of key early figures there.
Well, yes, it was rather odd. Grant, of course, famous for the Wheeling reaction, was there occupying a small personal MRC unit within which John Butterfield came to work in the late 1950s. And that was the only academic clinical research that was going on. Of course, there was research within the medical school departments, particularly in pathology and things like that, biochemistry. But the clinical research was basically clinical observation. It was classical stuff. You looked at cases, you recorded them carefully, you followed them up, and then wrote it up. But this little MRC unit, which was almost totally divorced from the rest of the hospital, the clinical part of the hospital, contained one or two extraordinary people. One of them was John Butterfield, and another was Norman Veall, who was a physicist who was the isotope man, whom I mentioned that a little earlier, and had quite a big influence on my earlier research career because I worked with him and under him looking at the use of isotopes in various systems. But John Butterfield was the person who was responsible. I may be responsible for you being where you are. John Butterfield was certainly responsible for me being where I've got to. He made clinical inquiry seem exciting, and he was an unconventional person. For a long time, he carried his goods around in a sort of trug, a wicker basket we might use in the garden. I wouldn't say he was eccentric, but he was very, very different from the average guy's person. At that time, the hospital was run by a handful of people, and the consultants, the attending physicians, I think in American term, would be, came in from their West End practices, many of them in black coats and black striped trousers, taught for free, in fact, at that time, and then went away again. the hospital was structured in a wholly different way from what it is now. And so the surgeons, of course, visited and did operations as well. But the idea that there was somebody there who was continuously there inquiring and working on the patients, whose one role, who didn't have a private practice, who didn't have a practice outside, they were entirely based within the hospital. Guy's was actually forced to appoint clinical chairs only in the late 1950s. And John Butterfield was appointed initially as Professor of Experimental Medicine. They didn't dare appoint him as Professor of Medicine. But the university actually said to the school, I know, that they would take away their funding if they did not appoint clinical chairs. I think the people at Guy's were afraid that that somebody would come in, occupy the chair, and all the consultants would lose their freedom, as had happened in some schools elsewhere in the country. So that's a little bit of ancient history. I mean, the thing that I remember most about the wards at that time is how different they were from today, with, if you like, the clinical atmosphere and the sort of. Some wards are now, especially intensive care units, are almost like labs. But in those days, you went in and there was a wooden floor which creaked with cracks between it. God knows what bacteria growing in them. There was an open coal fire in the ward, in every ward. And we used to see the patient with the registrar or the resident, and then go off and stand round the fire, leaning on the mantelpiece, and talk about the case. It has a sort of almost Victorian feel about it now.
There's another side to that, which I remember distinctly when I went there in the very early 70s. You could still then prescribe whiskey or gin or brandy.
Yes, indeed you could.
And what would come up but a bottle of Gordon's gin, a bottle of Johnny Walker. Wonderful before Christmas.
Yes.
But anyway, that tradition has gone, I guess.
Unfortunately, yes. And at that time, of course, prescribing, again, it sounds pretty medieval, and it was. Prescription was in the old apothecary's measure. There were minims and drams and apothecary's ounces. And one thing I might, just jumping back a bit, to get into medical school, 2 obligatory qualifications were that you had to have studied Latin and have a qualification at school level Latin, and you had to have botany, clearly with an eye on the pharmacopoeia, which was almost entirely vegetable at that time.
Well, I'm sure we ought to move on.
Yes,
that was the archaeology.
The archaeology, yeah.
I mean, it does. One of the things that strikes me is, I mean, I can't even conceive of how the sort of the body of Guy's physicians regarded these upstarts or these curious beings that were completely from a different world, or even had a different culture almost, a different cultural attitude towards medicine.
Yes, it was a different culture. I mean, I was able to move within 2 worlds. For instance, the first people I worked for was a physician, Will Mann, who just died last year, or was it the year before. Wonderfully cultured man who had, Chadwick and Mann is still one of the standard translations of Hippocrates, Chadwick being a Greek scholar. I mean, but Will Mann was a good enough Greek scholar to
be able to
contribute in this field. And he and I had a very interesting relationship over all the years when I started off as his houseman right the way through until I was a consultant myself. And one could see the best of the Guy's tradition in somebody like Will. But he appreciated that we were very different people, and I'm not sure that he was at all happy with the way things were going. I mean, one thing when intensive care units, I mean, we take them for granted now, but of course they only came in the late 50s, middle 60s really. I suppose the first time anybody ever knew that they needed them was the polio epidemics in the 50s, and that again takes one back. But we were discussing the name with for our new medical intensive care unit, and eventually it became called Starling. And he said, "Well, I suppose that's pretty appropriate." Will Mann said, "I mean, after all, they're all heart-lung preparations anyway." The other suggestion, which was Lazarus Ward, was put down very quickly.
So, I mean, against his background, what about research training?
Well, I mean, I went to work in John Butterfield's lab. I think the principal difference from now is that there was very much less technical help Basically, you were freestanding. As a research worker, you made all your own reagents, you labeled your own things with radioactivity, you set up you made your own buffers, you did the whole thing yourself. You couldn't go out and buy most of the reagents like you can today, and you didn't have anybody assisting you. So it was a very, very tough training in that you had to do everything from the ground up. You had a row of chemicals on the shelf, animals, if you chose to work with animals. We might come back to that again in a minute. Sitting in their cages, but you had to do everything yourself and learn how to do it. Obviously, there were people around who knew more about it than you, but basically, experiments took much, much, much longer to do, what I think would be the main difference. But of course, it taught you to think. I remember the sheer terror with which I started off. I didn't have any ideas. I didn't know what I was going to do any research on. John Butterfield's main interest was diabetes, so in fact, for 3 years I spent my time basically working in diabetes, and we studied two things really. One was glucose output from the liver. There was a big controversy on it. It was a hot topic at that time as to how much glucose output from the liver contributed to maintaining the blood glucose. And the other was, of course, the binding of insulin to cells, producing its action. Of course, we had fantastically this new radio-labeled insulin. So we tried to study insulin receptors. I mean, our experiments were so hopelessly crude that clearly we were studying non-specific binding, but we thought we were studying receptors. But those were the two topics that I pursued, broadly speaking, but as well as participating in lots of other. It was a marvelous. One of the things I learned from John Butterfield was to have an informal family atmosphere for the unit. That units work best when everybody knows and respects each other as human beings. There is no hierarchy. Everyone uses first names. And there is discipline, but the discipline is self-imposed. And that you should run, if you can create a huge happy family, you have enormously greater productivity than if you have some sort of machine. And I tried to apply that when I set up my own labs and my own unit, clinical unit. And I think it worked.
It was clearly evident in the early 70s, and it was actually one of the most wonderful things about the unit.
Well, I learned that from John Butterfield, basically. He was a most original person in many directions.
So how come he sent you, or you volunteered, or whatever, to leave diabetes and go to the States and learn how to be a nephrologist?
Well, I sort of have been interested in the kidney. I mean, having trained in physiology and taken a degree in physiology, I wanted to apply physiology to medicine because I could see how, for example, in cardiovascular disease at that time, the physiologists had applied physiology, had moved cardiology forward hugely. And obviously, that step had been taken, and in respiratory disease to a large extent. So I wondered what I could do, and I was vaguely interested in what the kidney did, and I'd read in my little notebook from my student days, I'd got papers on the kidney, and one or two papers on glomerular perm selectivity, even from people in Belgium. And I sort of got interested in this, and I thought, well, here is an area where the physiology has not been applied to the clinical medicine. Little did I know it would make no difference to what I did clinically. But I thought, well, this is an area that I could apply my physiological knowledge and background. And maybe I should turn to kidneys. So I discussed this with John, and John had worked in the States, of course, at the Hopkins. And an old buddy of his, Lovell Becker, who, because he was nearly 6'9" tall, that's 2 meters, 5 centimeters, I think, for those who don't speak inches and feet, was called Stretch Becker, because he'd been a basketball player, naturally. And so I went off in 1962, basically to become a nephrologist in the unit at Cornell in the New York hospital under Stretch. But actually I was a fellow of Robert Pitts. I still maintain my contacts with physiology. Pitts, of course, was... Homer Smith had just died when I arrived in New York, and of course Pitts was one of Smith's most outstanding protégés. A very gloomy man, I have to say. I never saw him smile, I don't think.
A clear textbook of physiology, a small green one, as I remember, beautifully written.
I still have my copy of that.
I think I have mine too, somewhere.
And it was beautiful. He was a very good research worker, almost entirely in animals, however. But he released 1 or 2 of his fellowships from the NIH, of which I was one of the fellows, to the clinicians so that they could do clinical physiological work. So that was exactly what I wanted. But in the meantime, I could pursue the clinical ward rounds. I could learn about transplantation, which was just beginning then, with rather disastrous results in '62. We're talking about now. Acute hemodialysis. News was just coming through about the fact that you might be able to go on repeating dialysis indefinitely, but that hadn't had a big impact yet in New York, at least. It was Seattle and Boston. And of course, studying nephritis, which I rapidly became very interested in. I realized that the immunology and the clinical aspects of nephritis really fascinated me. So remembering back to the studies on perm selectivity, and after talking with John Hardwick, who had worked on this with John Squire and John Soothill in Birmingham in England, and happened to be in New York at that time as well, I decided to look at perm selectivity in nephrotic patients and try and see with measurement of differential protein clearances whether we could assess glomerular function and whether it could be particularly, I was interested as a practical clinician. I was interested in bridging the gap between, I've always been somebody with a foot in research and a foot in the clinic. I always wanted to transfer research to the clinic rather than being purely academic. And it was easy to do that in those days because the two were much closer together. The gap has got wider, I think, since then.
And what about renal biopsies then? Were they?
I learned to do biopsies at that time.
They were really 62. They were.
Oh yes, you had. I mean, it was clear that to become a nephrologist, you had to be able to do renal biopsies. The previous year, the SIBA Foundation had held their epic symposium in which all those doing biopsies in the world met at the SIBA Foundation in Portland Place in London, and this little red book was the hot new Bible. Biopsies have been around, what, 10 years since Klaus Brunn and the others described it first. And
around in London or not? I mean, were people doing
Hugh de Wardener had started doing biopsy. He was the only person really substantively doing much nephrology in London at that time. I mean, there were other people doing dialysis. The Hammersmith were doing dialysis. But of course, that was in a urology department at that time. The urologists played a much bigger role than I think many people realize now in the starting up of dialysis, particularly. They regarded it as another urological procedure. And in every country, I think, the urologists had a major or even an exclusive role. But Hugh's unit in London, and of course there were the others like Birmingham, I could have gone there, but it seemed much more exciting to go to the States.
Of course,
and it was an immensely liberating experience. In those days, you hadn't got your BTA, been to America qualification. You couldn't go on in medicine, especially academic medicine in the UK. And New York was fantastic. I mean, it was not quite the first time I'd been abroad. We went there by boat. It was almost the last year or two when the boat was cheaper than the air, on a Fulbright scholarship and an NIH fellowship. And I'm eternally grateful to both those institutions for having given me this push.
I mean, one of the other extraordinary things is, at least looking back, that you went away and trained in nephrology in a year and then went and set up your own unit.
Well, yes, I mean, I had people out for me. I mean, John Trounce is the figure I must mention here. He was quite a remarkable man who is not famous outside guys, I don't think. He's still with us, I'm glad to say. Very modest man who contributed in many fields, but he took on, as a senior physician, all the politics for me and let me get on with setting up the unit. But essentially, yes, I was in charge of a unit at an extraordinarily early age.
And your status then? I mean,
well, I was at that point a lecturer.
Right.
And then I became a senior lecturer during the 60s and then finally a professor in the early 70s. But I mean, it wasn't usual for lecturers who were rather lowly breed to actually be running departments. But we set everything up, you know, we set up biopsies, we set up acute dialysis, and then eventually, a few years later, I went and trained with Stanley Shalden, and we did chronic dialysis starting in 1966, and then we set up transplantation with Frank Ellis, who was then the surgeon, and then Mick Buick, who stayed with us for many years. And we pioneered a lot of things. One interesting thing that happened was that Richard White was at Guy's, of course, and at the same time I was setting up the adult unit, he was setting up what was, in fact, one of the first pediatric nephrology units. This is 1963 now we're talking about. Pediatric nephrology didn't exist, and nephrology barely existed. But then Richard went off to Birmingham in 1965, and I was left looking after the children as well. I'd, had some general pediatric training, but in collaboration with the pediatricians, we in fact kept the pediatric nephrology service going. And for 7 or 8 years, I had a wonderful time working in hands-on frontline pediatric nephrology, doing some very new things, including founding pediatric nephrology as a specialty, in fact, nationally and in world terms. And I really do relish my attachment with pediatric nephrology, which is still present. I found pediatricians lovely people to get on with. I found children, although emotionally very wearing to work with. I mean, children dying of renal failure was not an easy thing to face up to. But I think it helped me to be a much better physician. I learned from the pediatricians, especially Ronnie McKeith, who was a very famous British pediatrician of the time, how to look at what the patient thinks of what is happening to them in the context of their life and their family, which of course is standard pediatrics. But at that time, nobody in internal medicine was practicing it. Of course, it's what's supposed to be standard today. But it made us establish, when we set up our chronic renal failure program a couple of years later, or about the same time, we entered a contract with our patients. I remember saying to them, we give you the starting ticket, but you've got to run the race. And we didn't realize actually that we were pioneering a pattern of medical care which would take many other specialties 20 or 30 years to catch up with. We just did it because one of the things was there were no rules. We were starting off a new specialty in a new area. People didn't know what dialysis and transplantation and things like this and the management of children and adults with renal failure should be like. So we invented it. So we invented a new sort of unit, which was a huge, as I said, a huge extended family, which people actually liked each other and wanted to work with each other, and in whom the patients had an active role in saying what should happen. And incidentally, in which the nurses had hugely increased, and in fact illegal, responsibilities. And I and Chisholm, who by then, next couple of years, he joined me from the Institute of Urology, where he'd trained with Joe Yerkes. We were hauled over the coals on several occasions for suggesting that nurses do things like sticking needles in veins, taking blood, supervising dialyses. And of course we were so overworked, we had no choice but to go down this road. And effectively the head nurse became the head of the dialysis unit automatically. And I remember the shock and horror in the early days when people came to visit us, and we sat down and had our weekly meeting, and it was chaired not by one of the physicians but by the nurse. And people almost literally fell off their chairs and their jaws dropped when they saw this from some more less flexible countries. I won't name which ones.
There were some very interesting and effective nurses too who went on to subsequently interesting and effective careers elsewhere as well. It touches actually on one of the things I wanted to ask you. I mean, who provided the help? I mean, the nurses, clearly, you've mentioned the necessity of that. The overwork must have been enormous because there were so many of the procedures, in a sense, were technical beyond the normal physician's technical...
Yes, I mean, we were in no better position to do these things than the nurses were, so we all learned together. And we rapidly learned that they were often very much better at it. And so we asked them to do it. But as I say, the legal end of nursing took a long time to catch up with what we asked our nurses to do, and we were operating in a very difficult no man's land in which we couldn't admit what we were actually doing. And things happened which were not very happy. We had the hepatitis epidemics, which was sweeping through dialysis units in the late 60s. We got ours. I got hepatitis quite severely and was off for almost a year. Were put down to the squalid conditions which we were operating under because, of course, the units were, we were doing dialysis in holes and corners. There was no proper dialysis unit. When we finally got a temporary building which was supposed to stay up, I think it was 2 years, it stayed up, was it 25, 30? I
mean, the atmosphere there must have been extraordinarily intense with the hepatitis, I think.
Oh, it was.
Particularly after the Edinburgh outbreak where... I mean, I think roughly 2/3 of the staff who got the disease died. I mean, clearly the guy's outbreak was was different, but nonetheless you wouldn't have
We
known
were
that
very lucky.
in
We
prospect.
had a much more infectious disease. It went through walls. People just looked into the unit and got it. But touch wood, nobody died. But I remember when I started, I realized I was yellow. I looked at the mirror and thought, is this it? Is this the big one? And of course, for 6 weeks, I didn't know, which was an interesting experience. Just got iller and iller and iller and iller. And it's a useful experience for doctors to be ill. I've explored that more recently since I've retired. But that was I think all doctors should have some serious illness which teaches them about fear and the loss of control that serious disease brings to patients, because otherwise they don't understand what's actually going on inside their patients' heads.
I mean, that's absolutely true. I think probably we ought to move on to more or less morbid things rather than more something things. I mean, so by then you've now got a renal unit, you've got a colleague, and really one of the things that many people of my generation in Britain actually, and I discovered in Berlin far beyond that, realised was that Guy's was one of the few places where glomerulonephritis, which had been rather a black box, and then had been complicated by all sorts of terminology, became much more simple and straightforward again.
Well, we just had to provide, as I've said before, it was cartography rather than science. We took all the elements that were available, looked at the levels of description. I mean, the problem was a very simple one, which really I think John Butterfield, first pointed out to me, or at least I first heard somebody articulate it. Everyone was talking at different layers. There was a immunological, pathological, clinical, all sorts of descriptions and terminology, and everyone was expecting one-to-one correspondence between these layers. And of course, the thing about glomerulonephritis, that like many chronic diseases, that it doesn't work like that. And of course, at that time, Boolean logic and Venn diagrams, I mean, we all think of it, everybody knows about Venn diagrams now. They weren't new. I got them from a chap called Wolff, W-U-L-F-F, who was a Canadian physician. And I suddenly realized the power of being able to use Venn diagrams to illustrate yes, yes, yes and yes, yes and no. And just it's such a simple advance conceptually, but it immediately cracked open all the problems of glomerulonephritis, really, that one had to just simply provide a simple account, dissect out the layers of distribution, show where there were correspondences and where there weren't, and use the Venn diagrams to show how they related to each other. I mean, it was a very simple task, of course, in retrospect. But it was, as I say, cartography, not science. But we were doing new things. We were studying complement in this new disease, mesangiocapillary nephritis, which, of course, the fallout from that through the studies we did then and later with Keith Peters and then Gwyn Williams, who joined us in 1973 from the Hammersmith, with the people at the Hammersmith, actually helped map the complement system, which, of course, was almost totally unknown. There were, I think, 3 complement components when we started, 2 or 3 in one pathway. And it was actually the study of some of the pathological conditions, such as nephritic factor, as it came to be known, in MCGN, that taught us this. So we were innovating in nephritis, and we were extending the map, but essentially the cartography was taking what was already on the shelf and arranging it.
Yeah, it seems to me the cartography is, I mean, a critical science. And there were a pair of papers in the BMJ that, this was well before I went to Guy's. I remember exactly where I read them and when. Well, not when, the when was out of interest.
Where were you when Kennedy was shot?
Well, I was sitting on my bed in my bedroom in a flat in Liverpool. But the curious thing is that talking, and I can't remember quite who it was, to just someone a couple of weeks ago in Berlin, someone from the States say they remembered those papers too, which struck me as being extraordinary. From the British Medical Journal.
Yeah, the BMJ actually asked me to write those. They said, you know, this is a mess. Tidy it up for us, will you? We think you could write us a couple of... I think there were 2 parts to them, weren't there?
There were, from memory, and again, the memory is emphasized. There was certainly glomerulonephritis, and I think the second one was the nephrotic syndrome, probably. With you roundly abused the term the acute nephritic syndrome, which in those, which I've done ever since. I have to admit. But the other thing that actually arose out of that is you must have got a large number of patients. Presumably you got a large number of patients initially because of doing the selectivity studies gave you the urine, and then the renal biopsy gave you the patient.
It was a very good advertisement. We offered to do selectivities, and we did them, for instance, for the International Study of Kidney Disease in Childhood. We did all the selectivities for that international endeavour. All the urines and serum came in from the nephrotic children all over the world that were participating in that study. We offered ourselves, Richard White, in fact, had started this. We didn't usually do this for the adults, but for the children, for a long time, I travelled around the southeast of England with a biopsy needle, doing biopsies in the units and discussing the cases with the paediatricians. And this was we only realised afterwards how a subtle and effective method of advertising this was, because of course it meant that they didn't lose control of the patient. They didn't feel they were being taken over, but in fact in the end we got the patient to manage, or we advised through them on the management. And of course things like how to treat minimal change nephrotic syndrome were hot news in those days. I mean, it's banal now, although people are still arguing about optimal treatment. It's interesting to see 40 years later. But yes, doing the biopsies and doing the selectivities meant that we rapidly got really very large cohorts of different brands of nephritis. And we built on that during the 70s, and were able, by the mid-70s, we had 10-year follow-up on quite large numbers of people, which taught us some very interesting things, and which led to a series of almost... It was a coffee grinder, basically. We went through all the forms of nephritis and turned out similar papers which looked at the presentation, the background, the etiological factors, the evolution in relation to the initial factors and the biopsy findings and what have you. And some interesting things fell out of that. Obviously, by far the most important one was in 1975, when, much to my annoyance, because I was pushing histology as a major determinant, but unfortunately, all these graphs seem to look the same for different forms of chronic proteinuric nephritis. And then I saw that the ones who did well within each group were the ones with the heavy proteinuria, and the ones who did badly were the ones with the heavy proteinuria, and the ones who did well were the ones who had minor proteinuria. And the graphs, again, were almost superimposable between the different histologies, focal sclerosis, mesangiocapillary, membranous. The two clumps of lines were exactly the same. The difference was in the degree of proteinuria. And I remember being very annoyed about this. But, of course, in retrospect, this was a very, very important finding, which we never properly published, to my regret. Otherwise, that would have been a real landmark paper. I presented it in several meetings, and it got published in sort of monographs and things, but we never actually had a paper in a standard journal saying that.
Chapters of books. I mean,
but people have, I have seen that slide from one of those papers flit through some of the proteinuria discussions in the recent years. And I think actually that probably was the beginning of proteinuria as a nephrotoxin.
I mean, one of the key things that you haven't mentioned was, again, the need for an analytical approach, statistical approach to the long-term follow-up of patients.
And of course, all those curves that I was describing were in fact Kaplan-Meier estimates of survival. And again, it sounds ridiculous, but when you look at the papers in the 60s, they're a boggy mess, because nobody quite knew how to describe what happened to cohorts of patients. Now, of course, the actuaries first, and then the cancer doctors, and then, before, I have to say, the nephrologists, the transplanters, had already realized the power of the Kaplan-Meier plot, the life table in actuarial terms, which is now obviously bog standard for absolutely everything that you do. But in fact, nobody had used them in nephrology. I think the papers we presented at the Priscilla Kincaid-Smith's on glomerular meeting on glomerulonephritis in 1971 or 72 were the first time anybody actually used Kaplan-Meier. I think we used them for our survivals of our dialysis patients slightly earlier in a paper we published in the EDTA. But
so where did you get the technique from?
I got it from the transplanters. The paper that I used was not Kaplan and Meyer's paper, which is, if you've read it, of course. It's pretty dense statistics. No, I used the sort of El Cheapo model, which was a paper by two from Seattle, I think, Cutler, who's a very well-known physician, and Aderer.
Yeah.
And they described how to use this for survivals in general, in medicine in general. And that was one of my biblical references to begin with Cutler and Aderer.
I remember the name.
I know them a lot. So does nephrology.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it really does. For someone around learning nephrology at the time, it actually made things comprehensible for the first time, understanding how to do things. And it seems to me the implications of that are enormous, not only for the natural history, but also the unnatural history, i.e. the treatment history is absolutely
well, you need
critical.
tools. You need descriptive tools. One of my great authors, I suppose most people of my generation were influenced by George Orwell, whose centenary, as you know, is just this year. So all sorts of Orwellianers coming out on the television and in the papers. But he wrote an essay, which is, for me, one of the key essays in my education, which was called Politics in the English Language, which he exploited as a theme in 1984. And that was not only how... He went back to Roger Bacon, who said, words are the footsteps of reason, which is something, again, I've been fond of quoting for the last 40 years. Orwell pointed out that not only did you need words, following Bacon, to shape thought, and if the vocabulary and the terminology is not right and is not there, language can be used either accidentally or deliberately to corrupt thought. And unless you get your terms right, whether they be statistical or verbal, you cannot describe something accurately and you cannot move forward. You need... Everybody has... Any innovator has invented or reinvented new terms, like, just to pluck one word at random that every nephrologist knows, dialysis. It didn't mean what it means today when Thomas Graham took it off the shelf, dusted it off, and said, this is what dialysis means. It means diffusion down a gradient through a membrane, etc. It meant falling apart, in fact, in Greek. My Greek's not very good. I only learned a very little second-hand. I didn't do it at school. But you've got to have new terms, and whenever there's great periods of advance in science, there are nearly always great periods of coining of new language. I mean, molecular biology. Think of the terms that we didn't know about, exons, introns, the whole... Looking back at papers of 1975, for example, none of this is there. The whole vocabulary is being created, sometimes in a very, very inventive and lively fashion. But the danger is always there that if you use sloppy language, you will have sloppy thoughts. And that's what Orwell pointed out to me. So I've been rather precise in how I use language ever since.
I mean, that's certainly been one of the absolute keys. Now, nephrology then was beginning to develop into a specialty as well. I mean, the beginnings of so many of the things that have been dominant happened then. What was the international community of nephrology like then? I mean, among the people, I mean, even just starting with the people in glomerulonephritis, it presumably was a small enough
Yes, it was a
group.
small enough group. I mean, I wasn't involved with the ISN meeting, for example, in 1960. I was still just on the house. In 1963, I had just come back from the States, so John Trance, whom I mentioned as my mentor, went to Prague for the second meeting that Jan Brod chaired in the sad Prague of the communist era. My first ISN meeting was in 1966, and of course George Schreiner ran that. And the huge expansion of the number of people in nephrology during those 5 years is something he has talked about. I mean, he was able to find thousands of people around the world that he could write to and invite. And I'm trying to remember the figure of how many people... There's a picture of the 250 or so people who were in Veall in 1960 by Washington. It already was in the low thousands. So by the end of the 70s, dialysis and transplantation, particularly dialysis, have multiplied the number of people that were needed as nephrologists to do the specialist things that we were good at, which was biopsies and dialysis. Of course, ironically, the nurses have taken dialysis away from it, and the interventional radiologists and the pathologists are in the process of taking biopsy away from us.
Well, what about the researchers, the people interested in, if you like, the development of glomerulonephritis? That must still have been a very small community, mustn't it?
Yes, it was. I mean, I think Priscilla did a great job getting us together twice in Melbourne for 2 meetings in 1971, I think 72, and 79, to look at the state of the art in those books were published by John Wiley, and I think they were landmark publications because they gathered everything together and said, where are we? And by the end of that decade, really, I think we had exhausted the possibilities of the sort of tools we had in our hands. Of course, very new, exciting tools were just around the corner. We didn't know that then. The monoclonals were just about to break in the early 80s, and of course gave us a new impetus and a new of interpretation, a new field that we could work on, and things we could have fun with, and that we did. But of course at that time I was still very heavily involved. I mean, in Britain, in contrast with many countries, one of the things, as you know better than I, nephrologists have stayed as polymaths. They've never specialized. Most nephrologists in Britain do dialysis, they do transplantation medicine, they do nephrology, they do a bit hypertension, they do pretty well everything. Inherited metabolic disorders, you name it. So, faute de mieux, from 1966 onwards, we of course had a very busy dialysis and transplant program, which I think was one of the best going. The tragedy of the early 70s, of course, was that it took us so long to learn not to kill our young transplant recipients. In those days, of course, we didn't transplant or take on elderly diabetics. They weren't on the scene. We transplanted exclusively young people and dialyzed most people of a young age, although very rapidly, funnily enough for Britain, because Britain has always had the reputation of being a place where dialysis was rationed. That notorious paper from Jeff Berline, who, having fled from Britain, emigrated, I don't know how he would put it, to Brooklyn, said that uremia plus being in the UK equals death.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, because 1971 is when I came to Guy's first. At that era, everyone was being dialyzed who it was thought it was clinically possible to dialyze. Whereas, I guess, where I'd come from in the northwest of England, there were still hanging committees, age limits of 35, 45, needed wife, 2 children, single man wouldn't be dialyzed. I'm probably paraphrasing and almost certainly exaggerating too, but nonetheless, that was the culture. How did you escape that culture? Why were you able to dialyze everybody?
Well, we tried to dialyze. Well, one thing was, of course, the rationing was occurring further down, as we all now know. Practitioners and general physicians were simply not sending us the older and frailer patients. But we did take on people in their 60s as early as 1970, which was very unusual for the UK and unusual for the world. And we transplanted them too. At a time when major transplant units in the UK and elsewhere had an upper limit of 45, for example. Oxford, I'll state a specific example, one of the finest transplant units in the world. But Oxford, for many years, had an upper limit of 45 for transplantation. Similarly did Belfast. Again, had wonderful results, very innovative. They were the first people almost to point out that we were poisoning our patients with prednisolone. And we actually did one of the first controlled trials to demonstrate that was so tragically late, as I said. But no, we didn't escape from it. We were protected by our colleagues, I think, to a certain extent. But we were willing to take on people. But we've pushed, I think, home. One of the problems in the UK at that time, which of course was not internationally present, was the tremendous impetus to use the more cost-effective home dialysis than in-centre dialysis. PD at that time didn't exist, of course. You put people on PD and they died, basically, in the early 70s. It's difficult to remember that now, but it's true. PD was strictly for acute renal failure. So we forced everybody into the home, and I think your criteria in the Northwest were, of course, heavily directed towards picking only people for dialysis who potentially, at least, might be able to go home and do it themselves and not spend too much money before they died, because of the appallingly low budget and priority that renal failure had. I mean, one of the things that I spent all my clinical career from 1965 to 1995 was spent lobbying for more resources for patients in renal failure. And somehow we pushed the intake rate from 10 per million up to 100 per million. But it was crisis management all the way, and something that, it's a blot on the history of nephrology in the United Kingdom, and it's a blot on the National Health Service Jeff Berline may have been aggressively overstated it, but he was right in pointing the finger and saying, as has Eli Friedman, again from the same institution, who's an old friend. I just saw him the other day, again in Berlin. Perhaps we should mention for the record that we're recording this just after the Berlin Congress of the ISN, which is a most fantastically successful
At which,
occasion.
of course, you were awarded the Hamburger
well, yeah,
award.
that wasn't planned. But yes, I got the Hamburger award. I'm immensely proud of that because I met Jean Hamburger first, of course, in the early 1960s. I wasn't in the first meeting that he put together with René Mach in 1960. What's often forgotten is that the two secretaries of that meeting who did a lot of the hard work were two people from Britain who were both French speakers, Joe Yerkes, and I'm afraid to say I have just for the moment forgotten the other name.
Was it Hugh de Warden? Or what
No, it was somebody else who's not, Bruin Lewis.
Ah.
He is a general physician, but at that time he was interested in post-operative renal failure at the Middlesex, and he happened to be a friend of Hamburger's, and both of them spoke French. Joe Yerkes, being from Holland, of course, spoke everything, or his family being from the Netherlands. And there I'll mention them because we have an interview, of course, with Joe in this Video Legacy series, I'm glad to say, which I did a few years ago with him, and he's still around and well. When I last heard from him. But their role in setting this up, I mean, Gabriel Richet and Jean Hamburger quite rightly have had enormous credit for but the role of the two secretaries, which was huge in getting that first meeting and getting the ISFN off the ground, I think deserves record on tape and in, and I think in his history of the ISN in Kidney International the other year, I'm glad to say that Ike Robinson took my hints that this ought to be mentioned on the way.
So we've really, in a sense, covered aspects of dialysis and the dialysis political situation. What about the technical advances and things? I mean, to what extent did they change the face of, what was it like actually dialyzing people?
Well, dialysis was absolutely totally different. I mean, in the 1960s, the first time I learned long-term dialysis, we started off with a coil dialyzer, of course. The 50s had thrashed through the rotating drum, Kolb's rotating drum was still in use in various places, in Leeds, for example. Frank Parsons brought dialysis back to Britain in 1957 against colossal opposition. And then 3 or 4 other units were set up in Belfast, Glasgow, Newcastle. In the late 1950s, but the coil kidney was coming through, the twin coil, the Baxter twin coil, which Kolb donated after he and Bruno Wotchinger, who's another person we have on record in this series, had established itself as the workhorse for acute dialysis. And some people, of course, used it a lot for, it's been forgotten now, but as for chronic dialysis. But this oxygenator that Fred Keel, who was a urologist in Norway, had built, turned out to be a very, very nice dialyzer, particularly because it didn't require a pump, which made it very safe for using at home. So we all learned our dialysis on building a keel. And there's if you take an exploded diagram, I've used this slide often, and I have it in some of the things I've written. All the layers you had to put together and clamp and make airtight, watertight, blood-tight before you could even dialyze the patient. It was quite a horrendous business. And that was the first thing. It was about that long, about that wide, whereas a hollow fibre is a bit bigger than this glass. The monitoring was very, very crude. We did all sorts of abominable things to our patients. We poisoned them with copper, filled them full of distilled water, and they took it all on the chin.
I mean, one of the things that Chisholm Ogg, who I've spoken to about these things, said he thought it was absolutely wonderful. You were just as at home with a screwdriver as you were with a stethoscope.
Oh, you had to be a plumber.
Now, I mean, I can see that in a sense. I can see Chiz relishing that slightly more than you.
Well, no, I had fun. The Jubilee clip was one of my, the thing you put on the plastic for fixing plastic pipes to the wall. I could not only build a kidney, I could build and take down and reassemble and repair a dialysis monitor of the period. And I wrote the manual for the dialysis monitor. At that time, of course, there was very little, there were few manufacturers. Most things were homemade.
Yeah.
A lot of our first kidney was made in our hospital workshop that we dialyzed, used in 1962. So, yes, we had to be very practical people. That's why I was saying about a lot of physicians who drifted into dialysis in the 60s and 70s were in fact surgeons, they liked putting in shunts and then later on fistulas, and they also liked fiddling with machinery, tinkering with things in basements. One of the sad aspects of this, which has scarred nephrology to my mind over the period of its development, is the division between people who do mainly dialysis and people who are in the ivory towers of channelopathies in the proximal tubule. There has been a failure of understanding in many countries between the two groups, and it's taken a long time and a lot of hard work on many people's parts to bring the groups together and weld them into one.
And that's, in a sense, a problem that's getting worse and worse as the vast numbers of patients on dialysis now is in fact overwhelming the relatively smaller number of patients approaching that.
Yeah.
Although that, of course, might change with better preventative
one
treatments
hopes,
extending.
fingers crossed. It's been a wonderful thing to see. I mean, I lived most of my clinical career with no hope, really, sensibly, except for treating blood pressure and treating obstruction for real prevention. But then now in diabetes and glomerulonephritis, there's real hope. That
I mean, presumably there must have been real hope at the beginning. I mean, it must have been...
We thought that we would cure nephritis with these ghastly poisonous drugs like cyclophosphamide and corticosteroids that we used on people in ridiculous doses to begin with and still used today. It's a terrible thing that for 40 or 50 years, certainly for 40 years, corticosteroids and nitrogen mustard, essentially, which were introduced in 1950, were the standard and only immunosuppressant drugs, not only in glomerulonephritis and in immune disorders like lupus and GN, but also in transplantation. I mean, we had the same repertoire of tired drugs, which with their dangers and difficulties, really until very, very recently. And it's a delight to see that we now have a repertoire of drugs that we can choose that do things much more effectively.
If only we knew how to use them.
If only we knew how to use them most optimally. Yeah.
Well, there were certainly a large number of nasty drugs flying around in the transplantation field when I first joined.
Yeah.
But Guy's had really one of the very biggest and most productive transplant units in the UK at that time. And I don't know about how numbers varied with other big units in the world.
I think we were one of the biggest, partly because we drained from such a large area, but part of it must be the energy of Mick Buick and subsequently Jeff Kaufman and the others. Mick, as our transplant surgeon, had an energy, I mean, he made me feel tired, very tired. And his energy, particularly in promoting organ donation and getting kidneys, was largely responsible for the size of our program. So I suppose we had lots of quantity. The quality wasn't so bad either. I mean, one of the things we were able to do, as I said earlier, we were, I think, one of the first people, although the paper's never quoted now, to show in a controlled trial far later than we should have done it. We should have run the controlled trial a decade earlier. It's difficult to remember now that controlled trials were still an innovation in nephrology in the 1960s. In fact, we published one of the first in 1968 in steroids and azathioprine in the nephrotic syndrome, just about the same time as the MRC trial came out. I think that was the first one. So the trial we did in 1979 on high-dose versus low-dose initial steroids, which absolutely conclusively showed what Molly McGowan in Belfast had been saying, that high-dose steroids to begin with were lethal, and not only didn't make things better, they made it worse, was 10 years too late. I felt guilty knowing all the people that we destroyed during that time ever since. The other thing I think we contributed to was when the monoclonals came in, as I mentioned again a minute ago. Of course, it was very exciting because we could study the infiltrating cells in the transplants and in glomerulonephritis in parallel. And of course, there were very few people who were doing both simultaneously. I mean, we had the same lab was looking at lots of transplant biopsies, lots of GN biopsies. And of course, the interstitium had been horribly neglected by ourselves and by everybody else in the nephritic studies. Drummond Rennie, an old friend who worked with us and with Harry Keane in the 60s and is now one of the editors of JAMA. I remember saying in the 1960s to me once, hell, I wouldn't know a tubule if you hung one round my neck. He was at that point working with Harry Keane on microalbuminuria, as it happened, in 1967. A hot topic in those days, and still today. But anyway, we were able to study the two things in parallel and unite the idea of the interstitium being important in both, obviously in transplant rejection, but also in nephritis. This, of course, was a very old idea. Hugh de Warner and Tony Risdon had brought it forward in the 1960s in a paper which still people quote in the Lancet. And then Adalbert Bohler in Germany. Again, somebody who had the advantage of enormous numbers. I mean, he was the one person I used to look at with envy. They had even more patients with nephritis than us. I mean, if we had a big series, he had an even bigger one.
But the difference was that those were biopsies, yours were patients.
Yes, I think that's true. Although he had lots of clinical data, it was essentially a pathoclinological papers, whereas our papers were, I think, clinical-pathological with each balanced. And it was very exciting to find that in nephritis, the infiltrate was exactly the same as in rejecting transplants, because I mean the light bulb went on at that point, because clearly we'd been looking at in the wrong place, and of course the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, the other thing that was missing before the monoclonal era was the lymphocyte, of course.
Yes.
The lymphocyte was completely irrelevant to nephritis, I mean, remarkably.
Well, yes, one of the things we were able to show, in fact, was that there were lymphocytes there in the... Other people had done this, of course, before. Bob Atkins and others had done, who later became president of the ISN, of course, had shown that macrophages were important in experimental and clinical nephritis. And then all the old work from the Japanese back to 1950s, the macrophage suddenly came in. And the macrophage was, I suppose, the cell of the, of the 70s. And then the lymphocyte was the cell of the 80s, largely because of the monoclonals. And in fact, we were, I think, one of the first groups to show that there were lymphocytes, probably up to no good, very early on, present in human nephritis. Other people had shown this, of course, in experimental nephritis several times, but we, again, with our huge biopsy library, we could go back and, you know, they were all lying there, apart from a few disastrous refrigerator accidents, which I think every unit suffers from. I mean, one of the things I learned very early on was keep your sera, keep case notes, and keep biopsies forever. Don't throw anything away. Become a squirrel. Hoard it away, because you'll be able to go back, and if a new idea or technique comes in, you can go back and answer a question in a matter of minutes. Nowadays, of course, you and others are hoarding DNA.
Hoarding everything. I mean, I must say,
including the DNA.
I mean, having come through Guy's and then Hammersmith, I was amazed. I mean, it never occurred to me that people threw things away. Yeah. And it's only when you move elsewhere you realise that people clear freezers out in 2 years. Well, that's nightmare.
Yeah, but it's difficult to get the storage space. Now, we had fun during the 1980s, expanding. There was we had new toys, and again, it emphasised one of the fundamental lessons about science in general and medical science in particular, how tech-dependent you are on technology. I mean, where would you be without all the techniques with the gels, the radioactive this, and the chromatography, the blotting, the antibodies, the polyclonal and monoclonal. Your ideas have to be limited by finally what you can ask. Science is the art of the possible. I don't know whether Peter Medawar said that for the first time, but I'm sure it was said by somebody before him.
Well, who are the big players? I mean, the people who you sort of related to in this time. I mean, who are the sort of figures who you, as one of the sort of key players at the time, looked to with perhaps not, looked to actually as the people who were challenging you I mean, or the rivals. I mean, I know that you don't actually think in those terms at all, and
well, one of that, you raised a very good point, because one of the problems about the way science and medical science have developed is that now, with commercial development, particularly in the last decade, with patents, I mean, the first reaction 30 years ago to anyone who found anything was to ring up all their friends, or write them a letter. It wasn't email in those days, and tell them what they'd found. And I only realized once from something that Keith Peters said to me, that, you know, no, I mustn't give that away. You know, so-and-so will get there first. And this wasn't an attitude I had ever, you know, ever come across before. But of course, that, not that Keith invented it, it was just that it was becoming necessary for for funding purposes, and now, of course, for commercial exploitation, for collaborations with firms, that people no longer discuss their results as openly as they used to. They don't discuss them until their paper's accepted in Cell or Nature if it's really hot stuff. The sort of stuff I was publishing wasn't that earth-shattering. But I do detect a problem there, that rivalry is now the name of the game. You get there first. Whereas cooperation in the times that... So you're right. We looked up to people, of course, but we wanted to work with them, and we sent them... We swapped samples and we stopped things. Science is entirely about this. I mean, science is dependent on openness. I mean, it's back to another of my gurus, Karl Popper, long before he became fashionable, I have to say. In fact, I'm not sure in science I wasn't partly responsible for making him popular. Peter Medawar, of course, was as well. But remember he wrote a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is about the fact that the conditions that are necessary for political freedom, they're the same conditions that are necessary for scientific freedom. And there's nothing absolute about science. Science won't go on forever. Unless we preserve the milieu which allows science to continue in an open fashion, we will destroy it. And I am seriously worried that we are moving in the direction of destroying the absolute basis of science, which is sharing of ideas. So yes, I mean, Hamburger terrified me when I first met him. I mean, he was this god who had sort of more or less invented nephrology, and he started the ISN, built a building which was bigger than our hospital just for nephrology, the Palais du Rhin, and the Necker, which is still going strong in Paris. Priscilla, of course, I mean, she was interested in, she was a polymath like I was, I guess, like dipping her toe in everything. And she and I...
She was vigorously combative, though.
And she was quite competitive. But, I mean, we worked in parallel and shared a lot of ideas over the years, and I count her as a colleague. On the histological side, particularly René Habib, of course, who's been a very, very old dear friend for, since I first met her in the early 60s, and we still are in contact. And we shared many things together, debates. We argued a lot, of course, but that's part of science, is about openness and discussion, as well as, and of course you need differences of opinion. And if they're emotionally charged, that doesn't matter. But once you see people getting emotionally addicted to their ideas beyond a certain point, you know those guys have gone over the top and down the other side. They're going to stop thinking clearly about this. They've lost their grip on the science. And it's something that I think some people haven't learned in all fields.
In glomerulonephritis, I'm not sure if that provides a good example of that, or in one way or another.
I'm obviously not going to quote any names.
No, I wasn't going to say that. What I was going to bring up was actually how useful, in a sense, you found the experimental contributions that were being made. I mean, they have allowed fundamental things to have happened.
I mean,
but there's been a chasm between the two for much of the life of nephrology, actually.
Well, I mean, the old business about man doctors and rat doctors has always been there. I mean, there are some people like Dick Glassock, for example, who's another of my old great friends whom I've enjoyed and collaborated with, and, who can do both. But it's difficult to do both, and now it's becoming increasingly difficult. It's very, very difficult to be it's no longer a rat doctor, you have a clone doctor, as well as working in the clinic. It's very difficult to bridge that gap, and there's a tremendous need for the clinician scientist to be coddled and preserved. I mean, Don Selden, another president of the ISN, with whom I've interacted over the years, has many times emphasized the importance of the clinician scientists, of trying to get a career path, as we have in the United Kingdom, and you've played a role in this yourself, along with many others, to try and find people who can and think in both terms, who can see the relevance of the clinical stuff, and also operate amongst the fundamental biology, which is probably where most of the major advances are going to occur. But it's still extraordinary how, from time to time, clinical aberrations and clinical observations do throw up clues that are of fundamental importance in basic science. There's still things in there that clinicians can notice. And if they don't tell the people who are working in basic science about them, they say, I've always wondered why, ... and put that to somebody who's got the technology in molecular genetics to try and sort it out. Unless if that communication breaks down, we're going to lose an enormous amount. Humanity is going to lose a lot. People are going to suffer more, and intellectually, as scientists and in the world of ideas, we're going to lose out. So we have to work very hard at keeping that gap from opening.
I mean, one of the questions I really wanted to ask is, in a sense, again, sticking with experimental models of glomerulonephritis and the like, did you as a clinician, or at least as a person primarily interested in the pathogenesis and natural history of human disease, feel you gained things from the insights that, I mean, the paradigms of the day, acute and chronic serum sickness and all of those sorts of things?
We did relatively little work.
We
did some, which has been forgotten. Except some. One thing that I don't think should have been forgotten was we worked with. We saw very early on that two mediators were going to be very important. One was PDGF, and the other was TGF-beta. I remember saying in Stockholm in 1989, TGF-beta is going to be the mediator of the 1990s. Well, it wasn't. It was nitric oxide, but we were almost right. Yeah. But we did do some work with PDGF in animals in the 1980s. And while we were on that, of course, platelets, of course, were a very big interest of mine for many years. I mean, again, this is something that Priscilla and I had in common. We were very interested in the role of coagulation in its broadest sense. Coagulation is inflammation, inflammation is coagulation, except they're studied in hematology labs and immunology labs. That was our thesis, basically. And we tried very hard, both therapeutically and experimentally and clinically, to show that coagulation, and my main interest was not in fibrin and the cascades, but in platelets. And ironically, I mean, we stained biopsies, again, antibodies came in that we didn't have. In 1981, we got antibody against what was then called platelet factor 4. And so we went hunting it, and we showed that it was present around, beautifully, in a little halo around platelet-derived antigens within the glomerulus. Of course, what we didn't know, this was a chemokine. Chemokines hadn't been invented. The other thing that I might mention was my desperate attempts to measure macrophage inhibition factor in the late 1960s with a it taught me one thing, that any assay that has to be run in quadruplicate to get even vaguely useful results is a waste of time. Because we actually measured it. You got your macrophages to crawl out of a little test tube, and you measured the size of, if you remember, sensitization against streptococci had been, Zabriskie and others had worked with this technique. God, was it awful. And when you look at the sort of the explosion in cytokines, that was almost the first time people, I mean, the term didn't exist. Lymphokines, I suppose. And,
the lymphokines were, they were the first ones.
But I think macrophage inhibition factor was probably the first. It's interesting that it's just made a comeback.
Yeah,
There are hot papers on that now. But God, that scarred me. I never published the stuff, 'cause it was just again, it teaches you, you need methods of measurement. Science is measurement. And I know who said that. That was Carl Ludwig. Definitely.
Yeah.
If you can't measure it, you're nowhere.
Yeah.
It becomes, well, you're in the field of the arts. Not that there's anything wrong with the field of the arts. I love them. But it's not science.
Well, in a sense, that flags up quite naturally an art which you've certainly had, but in a rather curious, in a rather untypical way, and that's, I've accused you elsewhere of being a politician, and I now can give you the opportunity to respond formally.
Well, yes.
You have actually headed up an enormous number of the, and been responsible for enormous numbers of the, what can only really be described political changes within the world of nephrology over the last 30 years.
I think that's true. I mean, I've had a hand in founding, in the 60s, I had a hand in a lot of the societies, which, I mean, I think we just saw the need, we needed to be organized. And I also saw, because I was working, being a butterfly, as I've always said I was, hopping around from flower to flower, I saw what different people, transplanters, dialyzers, immunologists, physiologists, clinicians were doing, and I saw the need to try and get them together to do things. And so, yes, I've tried to make things happen, basically, which is what politics is about. Try to make people see that your way of doing it is the easiest way, so that the thing, and especially if you can make them think that it was their idea, then you've completely won. And that is, I suppose, the fundamental art of politics. But despite having occupied all these offices of president of this and chairman of that, and I haven't actually sought any of these. I've been more interested in the things that happen. But if that's the way to make it happen, then that's the way to go. You have to take the drudgery of being the president or whatever, or the secretary.
Which worth considering, though, I mean, in just a little detail. I mean, you were president of the European Society of Pediatric Nephrologists,
which is
way
a little
back,
odd.
which was 1975.
In Cambridge. Wonderful meeting. People still occasionally come up to me and say, you know, Stewart, that was one of the meetings I still remember. It was marvellous. It was a small group of people. We were still all friends. We all knew each other. We were still finding out exciting new things all the time. Not that there aren't exciting things now, but it was the scale, I think. And of course, being in Cambridge, it was just marvellous. And the weather was kind to us, and somehow everything clicked. I mean, I think I remember that as one of the best meetings I've been concerned with.
Now, I mean, a much more formidable challenge, in a way, must have been the EDTA, as it then was.
The role I took on there was to do something which was very difficult, which was to try and change it, continue to change it into the European Renal Association without dropping the dialyzers. We needed to make it general. Because, of course, the American Society of Nephrology had evolved entirely from the opposite direction. It had started out from the Salt and Water Club in the Bob Berliner and Gerhard Giebisch and the people working in physiology in Yale. And I actually have proper credentials for that. I mean, I said to Gerhard in Berlin the other day that I was, and to Don Selden, that I was a physiologist manqué. Not only had I been a fellow of Pitt's in New York, but I also spent my time in Homer Smith's hut up in Bar Harbor in Salisbury Cove studying things in the dogfish. So American nephrology evolved from, if one was being critical, Mandarin science towards clinical middle ground, and tried to incorporate the dialyzers. European nephrology started off as entirely within dialysis and transplantation, and had to evolve towards physiology. And so one of the jobs, I thought, Vittorio Andriucci started it as the president before me in the ERA, was to persuade this to happen without dropping off the dialyzers. Because I counted myself as a dialyzer and as a physiologist and as a nephrologist. And so I had, if you like, street cred in all these areas. And so that was one of the reasons I was able to do the politics, quote unquote. With the ISN, I think my main aim was to internationalize it more than it had been, to turn it into a machine, which it is now, for transferring money and resources from first world countries into third world countries. And of course, I wasn't alone in this effort. I was one link. I was a relay. It was a relay runner. I think Gabriel Richer, whom we haven't mentioned yet, you know, who was one of the greats of the ISN, ex-president. He was the first one to run a continuing nephrology in what was then, I suppose, although they wouldn't, they might be insulted, a developing country in Tunisia. I think in 1985. And I could see when the ISN came to London and we hosted the ISN meeting in 1987, that was the way the ISN needed to go. And I said in opening it, we had a 3-minute speech. We were told that Princess Anne, not Princess Anne, wrong princess, the royalty was going to talk.
Princess Alexandra.
Princess Alexandra was going to talk for 3 minutes, and we should, none of us, talk for longer than that. So in my 3 minutes, I remember saying that somewhere on the globe, it shows how fast things happen, the 5 billionth person had been born within the last couple of weeks. Of course, we've already through 6 billion and beyond. And it was our job to try and see that all the benefits of nephrology got to as many of those 5 billion people as could, and quite clearly this was not the case in 1987. And the huge expansion in programs of all sorts, I mean, Ike Robinson, Bob Schreier, everyone, there's so many other people have played a part in that. But I like to think I was one of the relay runners and handed on the baton after my 2 years. It used to be 3, of course. I must admit that running that meeting in 1987 in London was quite a terrifying task. I mean, first of all, was the awful realization that unlike the ETTA, when you ran an ISN meeting at that time, you were on your own. You raised all your own money, and if you made a profit, you could pay it to anybody you chose to, which was usually the National Society, which often was, of course, a very enriching experience, as it was, for example, for the Greek Society and then the ISN meeting in 1981. It helped give them enough money to do all sorts of things they hadn't been able to do previously. But equally, if you lost money, you went to jail and your house was sold. So almost the first thing we did was to form ourselves into a limited liability company. That was my first encounter with trustee liability, because it was really rather frightening. I mean, the budget ran to, you know, a couple of $1 million. You know,
at a time when $1 million was $1 million.
We were not, you know, this was not something we had handled before. We'd had the ETTA, the ESPN, for instance, in Cambridge in 1975 was peanuts compared with this. The other thing was, of course, it was for me personally, it was a rather arduous trail, because 2 things happened to me during that which shouldn't happen to the president of any meeting. I was thinking of this in Berlin with regards to Kai Uwe Eckhart as secretary and Eberhard Ritz as president of the meeting. That first of all, the secretary, who was supposed to do all the work while the president sits back and decides on strategy, of course became sick, and I had to do the job of secretary and president. And that was really a back-breaking business. And then the second blow came when the company that we had hired to, and were working with to run the company, to run the Congress, went broke. And we had to change horses in midstream and pick up all the stuff out of the middle of the stream. And after that experience, I felt I was covered in Teflon. I could take anything. And I certainly don't want to repeat those experiences. But as they say, it was educative.
Well, it was certainly a very effective meeting. I mean, again, another meeting that's talked about.
Yes, I mean, we tried. The only thing that didn't work was our sports afternoon. We decided to have a half day in the middle rather than at the end. And we thought everyone should go off and do something. So we had a run, and we had a cricket match, and I forget what else we had. The skies opened. England versus Australia, nephrologists. I still have the pictures of the 2 teams proudly there.
At the Honourable Artillery Company ground,
yes,
I think.
And the match was called off. We runners still went round, slopped our way around Hyde Park.
I'm sure the cricketers drank an awful lot that afternoon.
So yes, the cricketers went off to the bar to drown their sorrows. But that was my... I mean, I first encountered the ISN, I suppose, in I went to the meeting in 1966 and had been to all the meetings. But I went on the council, I think, in 1978. Somebody said, "Would you like to be on the council?" And I said, "Well, I suppose I don't mind." because I'd worked with EDTA quite a lot, so I had quite a lot of experience with EDTA, which came in good stead. So I got on the council then, and then eventually I ground my way through the executive during the 1980s, ran the meeting in 1987, which I think was sort of to prove, you had to prove you could stand the heat, and then you were allowed to become president.
Well, I mean, all this international activity, in a sense, emphasises again the enormous range of people over the years who've been fellows with you.
Yes,
from
well,
all over the world.
I've always said, and I said in Berlin at the Omberger Award, that's my greatest privilege, I think, has been to work with and help form and shape about 250 people, clinicians, research people, or both, over the period of from 1960, over 30 years, from 1965 to 1995. And it is a huge extended family, which is, it's lovely to meet them at meetings and to see how they're all doing. People like yourself. Many have achieved distinction that I expected of them. Some surprises in both directions, but always a very warm feeling to know that I can go to almost any country and ring somebody up and say, can I come and have a drink with you? It's a huge privilege, that. And again, one of the things we systematically did in our unit was to try and foster. We had a room, as you know, which was called the Foreign Office, which some of the, one or two of the fellows did not like that. They felt it was patronizing. I didn't realize this till later. But one of the things that I know that some of the fellows who were with us, and we usually had about up to 5 or 6 at a time doing different things, and we were perpetually grateful to them because, of course, they did a lot of the work in the clinical unit and in the research that we would not have published half the papers we did if we hadn't had them. But they met each other.
Yes.
And I know that many of them formed lasting friendships between Greece and South America and the Far East, Hong Kong. I mean, I said, basically, we've had people from every continent except Antarctica, and just about every country. And in some cases, in some countries, we had so many people, we helped shape the nephrology in those countries, and it's a privilege to be in on that.
I mean, in a very real sense, it was a one-man Comgan.
It was. And we built many of the features. I mean, basically what the ISN has done subsequently is to try and formalize and fund.
Yes.
Because, of course, one of the problems was finding money for all these people. I mean, obviously there were sources like the Commonwealth Fund and so on, which we used to exploit. Any time anyone said, I'd like to come and work with you, we knew we had a repertoire of sources that we could try and tap, which was, of course, recently the ISN fellowships. I actually don't know how many ISN fellows we had through.
I can't.
My last
perhaps ought to be able to answer that, but can't.
was an ISN fellow, so I have a special regard for her because she was, I think, my last fellow, Paula Fracinetti Fernandez from the northeast of Brazil, was the last fellow I had just before I retired, and she's been up. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to get to Berlin. She got stuck in an airport somewhere. But the first one, I'd have to look that up.
Well, one of the things we haven't touched on, or at least it's coming around full circle in a way, is that Aberdeen was not only the place you were born, but also a place where you did a certain amount of research as well. Yes. Again, thinking about a far-flung part of Britain.
Another field of I've been interested in. I was asked, John Butterfield said, there's this some scientist at the Wellcome who needs her PhD supervised. She's called Anne Simmons. And she works on uric acid. Would you like to supervise her PhD? And I said, well, I don't know anything about uric acid, but I'll provide her with the academic background so that she, because of course, working in a, she needed a formal academic attachment, and then that started a collaboration which is still active till today. I mean, we just exchanged some very exciting emails about genetic studies in familial hyperuricemias, which is a cracking topic at the moment. The genes are pouring out. We've found 2, and there's one that the uromodulin gene curiously turns up in the tubule to be related to a reduced ability to excrete uric acid, and we haven't yet got any hypotheses. But that was the beginning of a very long... First of all, we thought we'd solve uremia. Uremia undoubtedly was due to the retention of purine metabolites. And it's amusing to see, actually I've seen 2 papers within the last year reiterating some of the things, some of the carboxamides and things, but Anne was interested in the early 1970s. But we had a very long and fruitful collaboration with that. The Aberdeen connection, as you know, was the fact that we wanted to work in the pig, because we had begun, the pig's metabolism of uric acid is very similar to human beings, with one exception, of course, that it has, it can break down uric acid. And all the piggeries were taken up. Roy Kahn had taken up the one we would have gone to in the south of England. So we ended up doing this work. The nearest piggery we could find was 500 miles away. So we worked for nearly 8 years, 10 years in the pigs at the Rowett Institute here. And it was a very, very interesting and rewarding experience working with veterinarians to see their different approach to things. And we studied the clearance of uric acid in the pigs, and eventually with Françoise Roche-Hermel, who sadly died the other year, we were able to do micropuncture in the pig. It's the only time I've ever tried to do micropuncture. I won't tell you what Françoise said about my micropuncture technique. I did get a few pipettes into tubules, but it's the largest animal so far. She was very interested in doing it because, of course, deep down she hankered after doing micropuncture in man, which was clearly impossible. But here was we were working with full-size pigs, not mini pigs, not these little tiddly ones, real bacon pigs, large white landrace crosses straight out of the field. The piggery, of course, didn't even have a reliable electricity supply, so we had a generator. We set up the whole lab, everything, the infusion pumps to do the clearance studies, and eventually the micropuncture in a piggery. Which doesn't appear in the papers, but must be, they appeared in the AJP a long time ago. But it must be something of a first. But I think that was why Françoise accepted the challenge. She wanted to biopsy something as big as a human to show that it could be done. One of the interesting things that emerged from that was that we had great difficulty with the anesthetics for the pigs, for the micropuncture. And one of the sites that I have not forgotten since, which took me back to interest in acute renal failure in the 60s again, was watching a pig kidney whose cortex was completely ischemic, with the tubules collapsed, completely impossible to micropuncture, producing quarts of urine. Clearly with the whole outer cortex shut down. That's what halothane does to a pig kidney. But eventually we just used vast doses of barbiturates and they bled everywhere. My job was I went back to being a surgeon. I had to open up the pig and set the kidney up. So I hadn't done any surgery for I forget how many years.
I hadn't realised you'd done micropuncture in those experiments.
And then she did the puncture. It's in the AJP. In 1970, 79 or something like that.
I must have been obsessed with glomerulus in those days.
That was fun. But I mean, gout, I mean, talking off the record, my family has gout, and I had gout and have gout in the past. So there was some incentive for me to study uric acid. But it's a fascinating molecule. And of course, Rick Johnson, who's another old friend, I wish Rick had come and worked with us, but he didn't. I like him very much. Now down in Texas, of course, he's brought the uric acid right back into the center. I mean, he's done the things that we should have done properly. We were sure uric acid was toxic, and we knew it was doing things, but we were we were still trapped in the idea that uric acid was toxic through formation of crystals. We were pretty sure that soluble uric acid and some of its metabolites were nasty. That's why we went for it in uremia. But he's been able, in a series of absolutely beautiful experiments, blocking uricase in animals with oxonate to demonstrate how important uric acid. I've been very pleased to see those papers coming out. And Rick's also such a nice guy to be with.
Absolutely, he is.
And also a very bright person.
I mean, one of the things that's always amazed me is how you've managed to do all of these things, how you managed to find the time. Well, not only the time to do the things that are work-related, if you like, but also all the other things as well. I mean, how have you managed to find the time to do all of these things? Well,
you have to work very fast, concentrate extremely hard on what you're doing, and work very hard. But of course, there is a price. Families suffer when they're attached to people like me. During the 60s especially, when we were in early 70s and we were working virtually single-handed before we were able to build the unit up to something like a reasonable size, you know, like 20 or 30 people, when there were two of us doing the whole thing, you know, families didn't exist, you know, and when we got home, you know, Daddy, Mummy, who's that man who comes in and falls asleep on the sofa? That's your dad, that's your father. Don't wake him. You know, it's not a joke. It's a very real problem for the families of the driven. I mean, the drive comes from inside. And you've got to be very, very careful not to drive things over the limit. I was very lucky in that Margot, my wife, was able to come to many meetings. We always managed, even in the early days, to dump the children. The children loved, "When are you going away next?" they used to say. But it's something, yet again, we keep mentioning Berlin. As I said in Berlin, it's a part of the untold story of people who do a lot. But no, I've always been interested in trying to relate science into its cultural background and to the arts, and to, it sounds very highfalutin, but basically to see science as essentially one human activity which is part of a repertoire which is seamless. Science is exciting, and we're beginning to get signs that people actually recognize this, and that it has cultural value in itself, and that the history of science is as fascinating, as interesting as the history of painting or the history of literature, or as literature itself, that the way people discover things and work out how it alters. Science has dramatically altered how people think of themselves from Vesalius and onwards, and it's important that people realize that, and it's built in not as something over there outside culture, but as an integral part of culture. We haven't got there yet, but I think there are signs that we're getting.
Well, as usual, you were one jump ahead of me, because the next thing I was going to ask about was the work in the history. I mean, again, a broad cultural extension, but...
Yes, I mean, it was something that always interested me. I've always been I mean, I read general history, obviously, and the history of medicine in particular, because I'm a doctor, and because I'm a nephrologist, the history of nephrology. And since there was no history of nephrology, you have to write it. So that's what I've been doing. In fact, one of the earliest papers I published in 1964 was on history topic, on some histology, well, not actually, on some microdissection of nephrons that Richard Bright and a colleague of his did in 1839. So there's nothing new.
And of course there was a later paper on the re-examination of some of the kidneys from Bright's patients.
Yes.
Using modern approaches.
Every pathologist at Guy's has taken those out and studied them. Barry Hartley's produced some absolutely wonderful pictures from that, the most recently, but I think every pathologist who's been concerned with the renal unit of Guy's over the last 30 years has had them out. I think they were first dug out and restained in the 1920s or 30s by Arnold Osman and his colleagues. As you know, one of them has amyloid and two have MCGM, which is an interesting commentary on the sort of diseases that occurred in Bermondsey in the 1820s.
Now, you've always, in the sort of, if you like, primary historical research, emphasized forgotten people or under-recognized people.
Well, that's relatively easy. I mean, if you like, it's the soft option to go for people that haven't been written about or who've been forgotten. Because if you want to talk about Bright, you've got an enormous amount of baggage to be... And also, it's not so necessary to do that. I mean, one of the things I've tried to show is that there's enormous amounts of exciting stuff out there, which is nobody's looked at. So in a way, as we've discussed together before this interview's an awful word, chat. Why people get remembered and why they get forgotten is something that's beginning to fascinate me. In science in general and in medicine in particular, and obviously in nephrology precisely. Because there's got to be an anatomy and there's got to be some mechanism behind all this that we can crack. So we need a few hypotheses to try and work out why X is famous and why it has to be dug up and resurrected and articles written
I mean,
about.
to what extent do you think it's due to families? You've mentioned elsewhere about families of nephrologists and cited Homer Smith and Robert Pitts as being part of an extended family.
I'm Homer Smith's grandson.
I mean,
Homer Smith taught my mentor,
Yeah.
Stretch Becker, and Stretch Becker taught me, and Homer Smith also taught Pitts, Pitts taught me, so, you know, what we can all... I've actually wanted to do a formal genealogy, to try and draw out, you know, a series... You'd need a computer to do it, a series of stars, and of course, some people who've trained enormous numbers of people, like Don Selden, for example. I had the pleasure of interacting through a ski meeting, which they've run for years, with many of the people that Don trained and worked with. That's another. There'd clearly be a huge starburst from Homer Smith and from Don and so many other people, and well, Hamburger for a start, we mentioned. And it would be very interesting to know, and many people, of course, translated through several labs and
marriages.
clinics. Yes, and so it would be very interesting to look at who taught who. I mean, in the 19th century, for instance, Carl Ludwig taught almost everyone. Everyone who was anyone in physiology went through Carl Ludwig's labs for about 60 years. Quietly, you know. I mean, we all remember him for describing glomerular filtration, but in the 1840s. But of course, he went on for 30 years to contribute. I mean, he invented the smoked drum, for example. And that Farr of Volharden Farr. Farr taught in Germany a large number of Japanese and American pathologists, including Kimmel Steele, for example, who went back and influenced again another whole group of people. There are obviously these key people who, Volhard himself, obviously in Germany, who clearly influenced vast numbers. There were always loners, of course, people who stood uniquely outside this framework.
Was, in a sense, that was really
which is
perhaps behind my question almost. I mean, is it the loners that have been forgotten, or are there people within the well within the families that have been forgotten?
Certainly some of the people who have been forgotten have been loners. I mean, one thing, if you are part of this, if you train a lot of people, you will probably be remembered because they will remember you. If
for good or ill.
If for one reason or another you don't train people, or your lineage dies out very quickly, or you die young, of course, and have no chance to establish a lineage, then you have much greater chance of being forgotten. But that obviously isn't the whole of the story.
No.
I'm thinking about that. I feel a paper coming on.
Yet another one.
Yet another one.
Well, we've talked of it. It has been a chat as well. One of the delights is actually being able to sit down and talk without interruption for 2 hours or whatever. What have I failed to ask you about?
Well, I have my crib here. I will admit that I have a piece of paper here, but I haven't been using it at all. I'll just see if there's anything here that really bites me that I haven't said anything about. No.
Yes, it's rather worrying. We both have our cribs and we've neither of us used them.
Yeah. I think I have said all of what is in here somewhere. Oh, one thing, I mean, we mentioned this a little bit, but the roll hour unit, that was purely selfish. But I think one thing nephrology can be general, we touched on the doctor-patient relationship and the doctor-nurse relationship. I was far too selfish when I talked about our unit. We did that. But nephrology as a whole pioneered the medical pattern, which is now standard in terms of increasing nurse responsibility and patient contracts and cooperation. I think nephrology should be very proud of that. And it's something that has not been flagged from the housetops. I mean, it was not just we who were doing that. I think it happened more or less everywhere. That chronic disease, and somebody being on dialysis for 30 years with you, has to change the relationship and the way you treat a patient. And I'm proud of that. I think nephrology helped do that.
I mean, it's very curious, being someone who's moved from one unit to another after 20 years. I think the most difficult thing was actually the patients, because many of whom I'd known for certainly well over a decade, and many more than a decade.
Because I was very sessile. I stayed more or less in one place for my whole clinical career. I never intended to. I mean, when I trained at guys, I thought, what a dump. You know, apart from John Butterfield and Russell Brock, there's no way I'm staying here. And then in 1966, we got offered a renal unit if we would take on dialysis patients. There was obviously an opportunity we couldn't refuse. And then I still thought I would leave. I'd probably become a professor of medicine quite quickly somewhere else. But somehow or another, I liked nephrology better than being professor of medicine. So I've stayed a professor of nephrology all my life. I actively turned down the idea of becoming, because I could see that it would simply swallow me up in administration. I mean, obviously I've had to do my slog of administration, but I mean, this is a problem that people face now, and you as Regis Professor must know this as much as anybody. The huge administrative load that talented people have to bear. I mean, I've often thought, I don't think he'd mind me saying this, I mean, I always thought Keith Peters was appointed far too young to do a vast job, and that he needed another 10 years to explode his huge talent. And I think there were a lot of things that he didn't get to do. Of course, he's not that he's not brilliantly talented at what he does as a politician, in the way we've discussed it, in making things happen. But I sort of always felt that Keith might have done something quite extraordinary with another 10 years in the lab. And yet he got swallowed into the, what I would call the admin maw. If you're out there, Keith, please don't take offense at this. I'm one of your admirers.
I mean, I think Keith probably, I mean, I absolutely agree with, he could have done that if he'd wanted to. I suspect he deliberately didn't want, he preferred to do something else. Yeah. But I mean, that does emphasize the problem of people who get sucked into doing the next big job out of the default position, actually. And
they lose their ability anymore to see to use their minds for day-to-day research. And that's, we've discussed the gap between the fragmentation of science and clinical. This is another thing, the invasion of, in both the university and the clinical, the huge burden of additional duty that now falls on the form filling, the planned statements. I mean, I think we were hugely privileged, my generation. We had a Garden of Eden. We had
the world
a whole
was
new
expanding
specialty to begin. If you wanted to do something, you did it. And then you asked about it afterwards. Now you'd have to go through, I mean, we've often said that dialysis, if it had to be invented now, would probably never have begun. I don't know that transplantation would have got off the ground until there'd been 10 years survival in dogs. And certainly something that killed the first 17 patients, as happened with Kolf during the war, would never pass any committees today. I mean, it's so much tougher for people now. The burden of this vast group of people in chronic renal failure, as well as the burden of administration and the difficulties of dealing with all these different aspects. A chariot with sort of not 2 or 3 horses, but about 10 horses, all pulling in different directions. I think we were lucky. I think we were privileged. I really enjoyed my career in medicine, and I'm still enjoying it. I'm not over yet.
Absolutely, and I think probably on that note, it's time for me to say thank you, Stewart. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit here with you.
Okay.